I never thought the HOA could steal my land. But what I didn't know was that they were about to find out I owned the entire neighborhood. I had always thought of Pine Crest Gardens as my sanctuary. It wasn't just a house to me. It was my home, my place of peace. I spent weekends working in the garden, pruning my trees, and taking pride in the fact that every inch of my yard was mine. Or so I thought. I had no idea what kind of war was brewing just beneath the surface of this quiet neighborhood. It all started with something as mundane as a letter from the Homeowners Association. Those people you pay fees to so they can protect your community, right? Well, this letter didn't protect anything. It didn't even make sense at first. My land, my garden, my fence, my trees was suddenly under attack. But they didn't know who they were messing with. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I walked to the mailbox. The typical spring sunshine casting its warm glow over the rows of manicured lawns in Pine Crest Gardens. The neighborhood had always felt like an oasis, the kind of place where kids played outside, and everyone waved hello when you passed. But that day, something felt off. My instincts told me this letter wasn't just another neighborhood newsletter or junk mail. It had that official look, the kind that makes your stomach drop. The logo on the letterhead caught my eye. Pine Crest Gardens HOA. My heart sank. What was it now? I'd heard the rumors about the HOA getting more aggressive, more controlling, but I never thought it would happen to me. I ripped open the envelope, barely able to breathe as I read the first line. Dear Mr. Mitchell, this letter serves as a formal notice regarding unauthorized structures on your property. Immediate action is required to remove the offending structures. My hands shook as I looked up from the letter. I glanced across the yard, my eyes locking onto the rows of tomato plants I had painstakingly nurtured, the sturdy fence that defined the boundaries of my property, and of course, my garden. A garden that I had worked on for years. None of these things were new. They had been there forever, literally. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. The letter went on to say something about violating community regulations. The offending structure? My fence. My garden. My property. And to add insult to injury, it claimed that my land, my very land, was now considered a common area of the HOA. The first thought that crossed my mind was that this had to be a mistake. There's no way my property could be taken away from me just like that, right? After all, I had legal documents that proved I owned it. But then, as I read further, the truth began to sink in. The HOA wasn't just questioning my property. They were trying to steal it. They were claiming it as their own. I couldn't just sit there and let it happen. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the number at the bottom of the letter, hoping for an explanation. Hoping that maybe, just maybe, this was some sort of clerical error. When the phone rang and someone answered with a smooth, almost too practiced voice, my frustration only grew. Pine Crest Gardens HOA. This is Marcus speaking, the voice said. Hi, this is James Mitchell at 1478 Sycamore Lane. I received a notice about unauthorized structures on my property, but I'm completely confused. My property is legally mine. It's always been mine. Are you sure this is accurate? Marcus sighed as if he had heard this question 1,000 times before. Mr. Mitchell, let me check your file. There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of rapid typing. Ah, yes. It looks like the board has determined that your fence and your garden violate Section 8.3 of the covenant. These structures are not in compliance with HOA guidelines. What are you talking about? I snapped. My fence is perfectly within the boundaries of my land, and my garden has been there for years. This is ridiculous. I understand your frustration, Mr. Mitchell, Marcus said in that same monotone voice. But these structures are located in what has been designated as a common area. The HOA has the authority to enforce these rules. We ask that you remove them immediately or face daily fines. Common area? I asked, my voice rising. That's my property. How is it a common area? Well, Marcus continued, we're conducting an internal review, but as of now, the removal request stands. You can attend the next HOA meeting to appeal, but the clock is ticking. I was furious, but I knew arguing with Marcus wouldn't get me anywhere. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. Common area? No way. There was no way that land was theirs. I had the deeds. I had the documents. I spent the next few hours doing exactly what any person in my shoes would do. I researched. I dug through old paperwork, hunting down every scrap of information I could find on property boundaries and HOA guidelines. The more I dug, the angrier I got. This wasn't just some innocent mistake. The HOA was trying to pull a fast one. The next day, I took a trip down to the local courthouse to check the land records. I was determined to prove that my land was mine, that this was all a misunderstanding. And when I looked at the property maps, I couldn't believe what I saw. The HOA had been pulling this stunt for years, claiming private property as common areas, and using their power to coerce homeowners into handing over portions of their land. They had been slowly and systematically stealing from everyone in the neighborhood. Couldn't believe it. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. It wasn't just about a stupid fence or a few plants. It was about an entire system of corruption that had been slowly poisoning the entire neighborhood. I left the courthouse in a daze. I felt betrayed by the HOA, by the very system I had trusted to protect my property. And as I sat in my car, the weight of it all settled in. I knew I had to confront the HOA. I couldn't let them continue their scheming. But how? They had the power. They had the legal backing. What chance did I stand? I decided to take the bull by the horns. That evening, I made my way to the next HOA meeting. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was done being passive. I had all the evidence I needed. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. This was about fighting back. As I entered the community center, I was met with cold stares from the HOA board members. Judith Winters, the president, was seated at the head of the table, her sharp eyes cutting through the room as if daring anyone to challenge her. I stood in front of the board, my voice shaking but determined. I'm here to contest the claims you've made about my property. You have no right to take it from me. Judith smirked, leaning back in her chair. Mr. Mitchell, you are mistaken. This land has been designated as part of the community easement. It is not private property. Bullshit. I shot back. I've checked the records, and this land is mine. You've been illegally claiming it for years, and I have the evidence to prove it. The room went silent. The other board members exchanged nervous glances as I pulled out my files. Property maps, deeds, and records proving that the HOA had no legal right to the land they were trying to steal. Judith's smile faltered. This is absurd. You're making baseless accusations. Am I? I said, standing tall. Because I have everything right here, and I'm going to take this to court if I have to. After that heated HOA meeting, I left with a sense of accomplishment. But it was short-lived. The board wasn't backing down. They didn't even look shaken. If anything, they seemed more determined than ever to push me out. But something had shifted inside me. I knew I couldn't do this alone. The next morning, I decided to talk to my neighbors. There was no way I was the only one who had been targeted. I started with Tom, the guy across the street who always had a smile on his face and a beer in his hand when I walked by. Tom was a good guy, always the first to lend a hand when you needed it. But I'd heard whispers that the HOA had been giving him trouble too. Hey, Tom, you got a minute? I called as I walked over to his house. He stepped out onto his front porch, wiping his hands on a towel. Sure, man, what's up? I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to break it to him. But then I just blurted it out. The HOA, they're trying to take my land. They're claiming part of my yard as common area. I can't believe it. They're stealing from me. Tom's face immediately shifted from casual to concerned. He took a step back, glancing down the street like he was making sure no one was listening. It's happening to you too, huh? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean? I asked, frowning. This isn't just about me, is it? He looked around again, then nodded. They've been targeting people here for months. The Garcias, remember them? Their pool permit got denied last year. And the Patels, they're always getting fines for no reason. It's like they're picking people off one by one. And it's not just small stuff either. I felt my stomach drop. Why didn't anyone say anything? They're scared, man. They've got their ways of making people quiet. Most people don't want to rock the boat, he said. running a hand through his hair. But now I think it's time someone did. What's your plan? I could see the wheels turning in Tom's head. He wasn't the type to back down from a fight. I'm going to gather everyone. I'll start with you, and we'll work our way through the neighborhood. We need to show the HOA that they can't just take our homes. Tom nodded, his expression hardening. Count me in. Tom wasn't the only one who'd had enough. Over the next few days, I spoke to more neighbors, and what I found shocked me. Elaine, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down, told me that the HOA had been selectively enforcing their rules for years. It's all about control, she whispered. Judith Winters has her hands in everything. Landscaping contracts, building permits, she's got connections everywhere. And if you step out of line, she'll make sure you pay. Her words stuck with me. It wasn't just about my garden, my fence, or my property anymore. It was about power. The HOA wasn't just a regulatory body. It was a machine, one built on fear, intimidation, and corruption. That evening, Tom came over with a stack of papers. He'd been doing some digging of his own. Check this out, he said, flipping through the pages. The HOA's been operating outside the original covenant for years. They've been changing the rules without approval. And there's more. Some of the fines people are paying aren't even legal. I looked at the papers he handed me. They were old HOA documents, some of them dating back to the founding of Pine Crest Gardens. The more I read, the clearer it became. The HOA had been making illegal adjustments to the rules, selectively enforcing policies, and, worst of all, exploiting homeowners for profit. This is huge, I said, feeling a wave of both dread and determination wash over me. They've been doing this for years. Tom nodded, a grim look on his face. It's not just about your garden anymore, Mitchell. It's about the entire neighborhood. We needed to act fast. I called a meeting for the next evening at Tom's place. I wanted everyone who was willing to fight to show up. I wasn't sure who would come, but I knew we had to start somewhere. By the time I arrived, the kitchen was packed with neighbors. Some I recognized, some I didn't, but all of them had one thing in common. They were fed up with the HOA. Maria Garcia, who had lived in Pine Crest Gardens longer than anyone, was there, spreading out old HOA documents across the table. My husband kept everything, she explained, pointing to the yellowed papers. And I've seen enough to know they've been pulling this crap for years. I looked around at the group gathered in Tom's kitchen. There were 10 people in total, all of them with stories to tell. Stories of selective enforcement, of unjust fines, and of broken promises from the HOA. I took a deep breath. I'm in, I said, looking around at everyone. We have the evidence. It's time to take this to the next level. We spent the next few hours strategizing. Our plan was simple. Gather more evidence, go public, and hit the HOA where it hurt, at the core of their power. We couldn't just go after them legally. We had to make sure the whole neighborhood knew what was going on. That's when Elaine came up with a brilliant idea. What if we take this to the media? She asked. If we get enough attention, the HOA will have to respond. And not in a good way. I wasn't sure at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. We could use the media to shine a spotlight on the HOA's corruption, forcing them to act or face the consequences. Let's do it, I said. We'll go public, but we need everything to be airtight. We can't give them an inch. As the days went by, our plans came together. We gathered documents, photos, testimonies, and video evidence. Everything we needed to expose the HOA. But there was one thing we still didn't have, a way to get their attention. The HOA had already ignored our attempts to resolve things peacefully. They were too powerful, too entrenched in the system. Then it hit me. A plan that would make sure they could never ignore us again. It wasn't just about taking them to court. It was about making a statement, one they couldn't overlook. I called Tom, Elaine, and the others together one last time. We need to do something big. Something they'll never forget. The idea was simple, yet bold. Operation Fertilizer. We gathered the necessary materials, hundreds of pounds of manure, large tarps, and plastic sheeting. We were going to deliver it to the HOA's office. Not as an act of revenge, but as a message. The day of the operation, The tension in the air was palpable. As night fell, we gathered at Tom's place, each of us armed with a role to play. The goal was clear: get in, deliver the manure, and get out. The HOA needed to know that they could no longer operate in the shadows. As we pulled up behind the HOA office that night, I felt a strange sense of calm. We were doing the right thing. We were sending a message, loud and clear. It was midnight, and the streets of Pine Crest Gardens were eerily quiet. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the soft hum of our vehicles as we parked behind the HOA office. The rest of the neighborhood was asleep, unaware that their world was about to be shaken up. The trucks were loaded, 4 of them, all filled to the brim with fresh manure. It smelled terrible, of course, but this wasn't about the smell. It wasn't even about the mess. It was about sending a message that couldn't be ignored. Tom, Elaine, and I stood in front of the small group of neighbors who had gathered for the mission. We all had our roles. One group would unload the manure, another would cover important documents and electronics, and a third would keep watch. The plan was precise down to the minute. We had a narrow window of time, just under 45 minutes, before Judith and Marcus would return from their lunch at the country club. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Maria, who was in charge of the first barrel, asked nervously, glancing around. "It will," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We just need to make sure we don't leave anything behind. They've been doing this to us for years, but tonight we take the power back." Elaine gave me a reassuring smile and a nod. "Let's do this." We moved quickly. With practiced precision, we set to work. The first barrel of manure hit the floor of the HOA office with a resounding thud. The smell was overpowering, instantly filling the room and making my stomach turn. But this wasn't about the smell. It was about making a statement, a bold, unmissable statement. Each barrel we brought in felt like a victory. The office, once pristine and sterile, was rapidly transforming into a monument to our frustration. The harsh, chemical smell of the manure blended with the stale air of the office, and the once sterile, beige walls began to feel like prison bars closing in on the HOA. The same place they had used to trap us was now the symbol of their own downfall. As we worked, I could feel the anger and tension building. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. This wasn't just about the fine for some illegal water tanks. This was about the years of silent oppression. The times when the HOA had bullied people out of their homes, when their rules had been selectively enforced, when they had stolen from people for their own gain. By the time we had unloaded all the manure, the office was unrecognizable. Piles of the stuff covered the floor, leaving barely enough room to walk. We had been efficient, precise, and most importantly, we had made sure no permanent damage was done. The computers were covered in plastic sheeting, and important documents had been moved. The final touch was something I had been preparing for hours: a sealed envelope addressed to the board of directors. Inside, I had placed a flash drive containing all the evidence of the HOA's corruption, the video footage of Marcus poisoning my water tanks, the selective enforcement records, and the proof of their landscaping kickbacks. I placed it on Judith's desk, in the middle of the stinking chaos we had created. "Done," I said, looking around the room. The smell was unbearable, and my clothes were stained with dirt, but I couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. "Let's get out of here," Tom said, his voice grim but steady. We moved quickly, taking separate routes as planned. Our exit was as smooth as our entry, and within minutes we were back on the streets, driving away from the scene. But as I drove home, my mind raced. The deed was done, but would it be enough? Would the HOA finally see that they couldn't bully us any longer? The next morning, as I sipped my coffee and checked my phone, I felt a knot in my stomach. The plan had gone off without a hitch, but now came the hard part: waiting. Would the HOA retaliate? Would they find a way to make us pay for what we had done? As I scrolled through the news app on my phone, my stomach dropped. There, at the top of the local news feed, was a headline that I'd been dreading: Pine Crest Gardens HOA office vandalized. Residents speak out. I clicked on the article, my heart pounding in my chest. The story covered the manure incident, of course, but what struck me was the response from the HOA. They were calling it a criminal act of vandalism, a heinous and unacceptable attack on their office. The HOA president, Judith Winters, was quoted saying, "We will not tolerate this type of behavior in our community. This attack on the HOA office is not only illegal, but it is also an attack on the values we hold dear in Pine Crest Gardens." It wasn't surprising. They had to spin it. They had to make it sound like we were the criminals. But what really caught my attention was the last line of the article. The HOA has requested police presence at the upcoming board meeting to ensure the safety of board members and the community. They were preparing for war. They were coming for us, and they weren't going to back down easily. But we weren't going to back down either. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "This is it," I muttered under my breath. "They won't let us walk away. But we're not done yet." By the afternoon, the HOA had already begun to retaliate. I received a letter in the mail, a special assessment fee of $223,000 for environmental cleanup and damage to HOA property. The assessment also included a hefty fine for psychological trauma to staff, as if they were the victims in this situation. I wasn't shocked. This was classic HOA intimidation. They had no intention of letting us get away with it. They were going to try to bankrupt me before I had a chance to strike back. But I wasn't going to give in. That evening, as I stared at the letter, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Tom. "Emergency HOA meeting called for 3 p.m. tomorrow. Check your mailbox." The timing was too perfect. The HOA was trying to push their agenda forward, trying to wrap everything up and make sure their power remained intact. They weren't just coming after me. They were coming after all of us. But I wasn't going to let them win. The next day, the HOA meeting was held at the community center, and I knew something big was about to happen. Tom, Elaine, and a few others from our group showed up early, ready to make our move. But we weren't going to do this alone. We had backup. As the meeting started, I could see the anxiety in Judith's eyes. She knew we had evidence. She knew the jig was up, and she wasn't the only one. Marcus was there too, sitting next to her, his face pale. I had a feeling they both knew what was coming. I stood up at the front of the room, my voice calm but firm. "This meeting is supposed to be about my criminal actions, right?" I said, glancing at Judith. "Well, I have something to say, and it's not just about manure." I pulled out a USB drive and clicked a button on the projector. The room fell silent as the footage of Marcus poisoning my water tanks filled the screen. It was crystal clear. You could see him pouring chemicals into my rainwater collection system, all while speaking with Judith about their plans. Judith's face turned beet red. Marcus shrunk in his seat, avoiding everyone's gaze. "This is what your HOA has been doing for years," I said, pointing at the screen. "This is why I'm here. Not just to save my garden, but to save this entire neighborhood from your corruption." The room erupted. People stood up, shouting. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out finally found their voices. And for the first time since I'd moved into Pine Crest Gardens, I saw something that made me believe in the power of a united community. The HOA was done. The battle wasn't over, but we had won the first round. The evidence we presented, the community's support, and the sheer force of our will had been enough to bring down the HOA. Judith and Marcus were removed from their positions, and the community began the process of reforming the HOA to make it truly represent the residents of Pine Crest Gardens. As I walked through the neighborhood that evening, I could feel the difference. The air was lighter. People were smiling again. There was hope. I looked over at my garden. My heirloom tomatoes growing strong, the peppers ripening, and the flowers blooming. It wasn't just my garden I had saved. It was this entire community. And that, in itself, was a victory I would never forget. The days that followed the HOA meeting were a whirlwind. The media had caught wind of the chaos, and our story was making waves. It wasn't just about my garden anymore. It was about the neighborhood standing up against an organization that had become too powerful for too long. I had known the HOA would fight back. They had deep pockets, connections, and years of experience bending the rules to their advantage. But this time it was different. This time we were armed with the truth. The evidence we had presented was solid, and we had the support of the entire neighborhood behind us. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Judith and Marcus weren't going down without a fight. They had too much to lose. And as much as I hoped this would all end quickly, I knew the battle was just beginning. The morning after the meeting, I was greeted by an unexpected knock at the door. When I opened it, I was met by two uniformed officers, their faces grim. "Mr. Mitchell?" the taller one asked, holding up his badge. "We need to talk about the events that took place at the HOA office yesterday." My heart sank. I hadn't expected this so soon. The police were here. I tried to keep my voice steady. "What's this about?" "We have witnesses who saw your truck at the scene of the vandalism," Officer Lopez said, his voice cold. "The HOA president, Mrs. Winters, is pressing criminal charges for property damage, environmental contamination, and vandalism." My stomach twisted. This was it. The HOA was retaliating, using their influence to turn the tables. But I wasn't backing down. "Not now. I've already given my statement," I said, trying to keep my composure. "And I've got evidence to back up everything I've done." Officer Lopez looked at me with a pitying expression. "I understand, Mr. Mitchell. But you have to realize this isn't just about the manure. The HOA is a powerful organization, and they've got connections. I suggest you get a lawyer and prepare for what's coming." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. I had hoped the worst was behind us, but it was clear this was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to let us go without a fight. As the officers left, I stood there on my porch, feeling the walls close in. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking my thoughts. It was a message from Tom. "Emergency meeting tonight at 8 p.m. Everyone's talking about the police. They're moving fast. We need to be ready." That evening, I walked to the community garden, my heart heavy with anxiety. As I arrived, I saw dozens of faces. Neighbors I barely knew, all gathered together, some sitting on benches, others standing around in groups, talking in hushed tones. There was a palpable sense of urgency in the air. The meeting wasn't just about my fight anymore. It was about the future of Pine Crest Gardens. Tom waved me over and clapped me on the back as I approached. "We're in this together," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. I nodded. "I know, but they're pushing hard. This isn't just about fines anymore. They're trying to take me down. They're using the police, the media, everything they've got." Maria Garcia stepped forward, holding a stack of papers. "We've got your back. We've been collecting evidence, emails, letters, photos. The community's on your side." I looked around at the faces of my neighbors. Some were older, some younger, but they all shared the same goal. They weren't afraid anymore. They were done with the HOA's games. "We've seen what they've been doing," Maria continued. "We know the history, but now we have the evidence. It's time to take it to court." I felt a surge of hope. Finally, I wasn't alone in this fight. Finally, I had an army of people who were just as angry, just as determined to take down the HOA as I was. The next few days were a blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and planning. Dylan, the lawyer who had been advising me, worked with me and the group to organize our case. We had everything we needed: the video footage of Marcus poisoning my water tanks, the photos of selective enforcement, the financial records showing the kickbacks, and the original property deeds proving that the land the HOA was claiming was mine. But what we didn't have was time. The HOA was moving fast, and they were using their resources to intimidate anyone who dared to challenge them. Every time I stepped outside, I saw the telltale signs. Marcus's car slowly driving past my house, the occasional figure in the shadows, watching, waiting. I didn't care. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me anymore. We were ready for this fight. The legal battle was going to be fierce, but we had the truth on our side. And the community standing together was our greatest weapon. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I felt a mix of nerves and determination as I walked into the courthouse. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of the case hanging over everything. I could see Judith and Marcus sitting at the front, their smug expressions barely concealing the fear they must have been feeling. Dylan stood beside me, a calm presence in the storm. "We've got this," he whispered, I nodded, though my hands were clammy. I couldn't help but feel the magnitude of what was at stake. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about holding the HOA accountable, about ensuring that no one else had to suffer under their thumb. The judge called the court to order, and we began presenting our case. Dylan laid out the evidence in a clear and compelling way, pointing out the illegal actions of the HOA, the corruption that had festered under Judith's leadership, and the blatant disregard for homeowners' rights. The room was silent as the facts were laid out. And then it was our turn. One by one, the neighbors who had gathered in support of the case took the stand, sharing their stories of how the HOA had abused its power. From the Garcias to the Patels, from the Rodriguez twins to Maria, every single person who had been targeted by the HOA spoke with courage and conviction. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as each person told their story. We weren't just fighting for my garden anymore. We were fighting for the heart of Pine Crest Gardens. The ruling came a few weeks later, and when I heard the news, I couldn't believe it. The judge had ruled in our favor. The HOA was found guilty of fraud, property theft, and environmental contamination. Judith Winters and Marcus Jenkins were removed from their positions, and the HOA was ordered to pay damages and return the land they had wrongfully seized. Felt surreal. For the first time in months, I could breathe again. Pine Crest Gardens was ours. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was the neighborhood's fight, and we had won. As the dust settled, Pine Crest Gardens began to rebuild. The new HOA, elected by the residents, was transparent and fair. Decisions were made together in the open with input from everyone. There were no more arbitrary fines, no more intimidation. We were a true community again, working together to make our neighborhood the best it could be. My garden, once poisoned and nearly destroyed, had bounced back. The heirloom tomatoes I thought I had lost forever were thriving, and the peppers were growing strong again. The garden wasn't just a symbol of my hard work. It was a symbol of our victory. As I walked through the neighborhood, watching the children play and the neighbors work together in their yards, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we had come. This neighborhood, once divided by fear, had become a place of solidarity and hope. We had fought for what was right, and we had won. And in the end, it wasn't just about the garden. It was about reclaiming what was ours. It was about fighting back against a system that had taken too much for too long. As I stood in front of my garden, looking out at the new, thriving community we had built, I thought to myself, they tried to steal my land, but they didn't know they were messing with the wrong person. And in the end, I didn't just save my home. I saved the entire neighborhood.